well, this is great because every weekend I got a new group of yahoos in here who are, ripping it up. And it's like their big party weekend of the summer every single weekend. So people who, want a cottage for peace and quiet, all of a sudden, they're living beside Animal House next door. And every weekend it's a new set of animals. Hello and welcome to the next episode of Beneath the Law. I'm Gavin, Tighe, Thiele, my buddy and good friend. How are you this morning?
I'm great. I didn't have to fight a lot of traffic congestion. We'll talk about that later. And what can I tell you? It's a beautiful day here in the 6th.
It is a lovely day in southern Ontario. Very few of those in the last 6 months, and we finally are into spring. And I think that's uplifting everyone's spirits. And I was joking that it's been a long time since there were leaves on the trees in spring and Leafs in the playoffs at the same time. So here we are.
100%, but not a great goal last night. And I guess Morgan Riley got a hat trick, but not in the best way.
No, although someone was telling me that we just also witnessed the appointment, I guess, of the new Pope. He is the 267th Pope. And I take great comfort in that because that 1967, of course, is the last time the Leafs won the Stanley Cup. And I think that, divine providence is in motion here.
Yeah, well, I'm not a Roman Catholic, but I'll leave that to those who are Roman Catholic to draw that link.
Why not? We'll take, as a Leaf
Of course,
fan,
we'll take it. We'll take anything in Toronto.
Anyways, speaking of hope, an interesting dilemma. There's this seems to be a constant battle as we live in the age of Airbnb and other short-term rentals with people who we won't say own, because I think the case is interesting in that way too. But a recent case out of Milton, Ontario, and the imposition of short-term rental bylaws by any number of municipalities, banning or restricting the ability of people to rent out their property to short-term rentals through apps like Airbnb and or Vrbo or what have you, and a lawsuit that came out of that. So, Stephen, why don't you set the table, if you will, for this interesting little foray into the justice system?
Yeah, and I find this to be a remarkable case because of the factual background, and I will not. I will try to be short or brief with respect to it. So we have in the town of Milton, they introduced a bylaw to basically regulate the rental of a property for short-term purposes, 28 days or less. And a tenant rented out his landlord's house, advertising it on Airbnb for short-term rental. The landlord had not authorized the use, and there was no license. So in Milton, you need a license to operate short-term rental. And the tenant was advertising the property. The landlord found out about it and complained. Fire officials and town officials went out to the property, and the tenant was even boasting that he was using it as a short-term rental. A number of fire code violations were found. The tenant had renovated the property to add rooms. And lo and behold, a order was made that basically the tenant comply with all the fire code safety issues that were found, that the tenant not advertise the home for short-term rentals, and then he turns around and sues the town. He sues the town and says that the bylaw is illegal, and actually also claimed that he was being financially ruined by Milton and wanted something like $4 million.
Well, nice work if you can get it. I mean, I think,
sure.
So just going back, there's a few interplay of a few interesting legal concepts here. So first of all, these bylaws are, they're becoming very, very common I know that you had an altercation with the municipal authority in the great state of Hawaii and
We're still dealing with that altercation, and I'm actually very well versed in terms of short-term rental uh, uh, industry and bylaws or laws that are trying to impact that industry. There are a lot of jurisdictions, as you say, Gavin, that are dealing with this issue. They see it as cities see it as a way to create more affordable housing. I think studies have suggested that that's not the case. Um, in certain tourist areas, where you have ships come in, let's say into port in Spain, Barcelona, you have, the influx of 30 or 40,000 people at the same time. So, uh, uh, the local inhabitants are complaining. Um, but it's a kind of uneven problem.
so, I do think though that let's just law is always about balance of interest. So let's talk about
Right.
the two sides of the coin. And there's always two sides of a coin. There's a reason why, when you see those statues of Lady Justice, she's got the scale with two sides of it. So that both sides of the equation, have some merit, and certainly there's a political side to it. So your point is well taken, because a lot of people buy um, holiday properties or recreational properties or other types of properties thinking, look, I can carry this property because it's going to earn income for X number of months a year that I'm not using it, and that will help me to carry the cost of it, and then I'll get my use of it as well. And then there are other people, I suppose, who buy properties purely for investment purposes, that they buy, a property for X dollars, and they figure I'll make X, X a week out of this thing. And over the course of the year, I'll make this much money, and it'll be a profitable enterprise for me to carry that property. So there's a legitimate commercial expectation, and people go into these properties with that, frankly, that equation. I mean, they buy the property thinking it's going to earn X amount of dollars. Therefore, it's worth whatever. I mean, when you buy any asset, any income producing asset, you look at, how much income can it produce, and what something is worth as an income producing asset is generally a function of how much income it can produce. So people go into it with that math and that equation. And when you get municipalities, then on the other hand, you hear all sorts of horror stories. Like in cottage country in Ontario, there are tons of municipalities that have put in bylaws that say no short-term rentals. And the reason for that is that other residents are saying, well, this is great because every weekend I got a new group of yahoos in here who are, ripping it up, and it's like their big party weekend of the summer every single weekend. So people who, want a cottage for peace and quiet, all of a sudden, they're living beside Animal House next door, and every weekend it's a new set of animals. So that's a legitimate, I think, a legitimate reason why you would want to restrict that.
Sure, of course. And look, there are certain areas in the world that are basically tourist destinations, and a government at a certain point in time has made a decision that a certain area should be allowed to put in a short-term rental, or you should be able to use your units as short-term rentals. And you have 95% of owners in, let's say, a condo complex renting their properties out as short-term rentals, and I think that's legitimate. In cottage country, I think the issue is that you have groups of people who are local inhabitants, and all of a sudden you have a neighbor, a handful of neighbors using their properties as short-term rentals. And so you can see where a municipality wants to restrict that use because it does impact the actual local residents. But, getting back to this case, what I find remarkable is the tenant just basically using the landlord's property without authorization for short-term rental, and then modifying the property.
Well, it highlights a couple of big issues here in Ontario, which is the perennial complaint of landlords that it's virtually impossible to get rid of a bad residential tenant.
Right.
And so here, this guy, we say he's a residential tenant. He wasn't a residential tenant. He was he was renting a home to turn it into a hotel and leveraging his residential tenancy, which wasn't residential at all. It was clearly for a commercial purpose.
Yeah,
He was
and in fact, fire officials said that basically he had converted a residential use into a lodging home.
right.
Or,
And that raises a whole, I mean, you step back and you think about it, that raises a whole series of other issues. I mean, if a hotel has way more safety requirements, etc., all sorts of regulation on it as a commercially run lodging house, as you put it,
right.
then your house does. I mean, there's all sorts of regulations, and for good reason, that if you're in a hotel, govern the operation of the hotel that don't govern you in your own home.
Yeah, you've got you've got sprinkler systems that need to be put in. I think that's probably one of the largest regulations from a fire safety perspective. And you're right. There's other regulations. Taxes are different if you're operating a commercial business versus a residential business. So there's lots of things, but
and they should be. I mean, and the other,
yeah,
this case is an object lesson in that, because we had this is literally the tenant from hell. You get some guy rents your house and you're getting whatever a month, which is great. And then all of a sudden he gets in there and he converted the basement into like a whole series of like little compartments, turned the laundry room into a apartment. And he basically turned it into a rooming house. And that sounds, pretty scary when you think about it, because we talk about regulations. There's a reason why you've got to have sprinkler systems in a hotel. There's a reason why you got to have fire escapes in a hotel, because you get, that number of people in a building, and, something happens, like there's a fire, and all of a sudden it could be a real tragedy. I mean, if you had, 15 people sleeping in the basement of your house, and they're in their little compartments that you've created with plywood and 2x4s, and all of a sudden there's a fire and there's one exit. I mean, there's no other way to get out of the place. I mean, you could think of, it could be pretty horrific in terms of the tragedy that could be incurred in that type of situation. So those regulations exist for a reason, and that pretty good reason.
100%. And, look, there are examples of rooming house fires, or people getting in situations where they're leasing a bedroom or a basement, and there's a fire, and, people do die in those fires because they have no escape route. And, it's like I said, this is a remarkable case that the tenant turns around and brings an application, a lawsuit, a proceeding against the town, and says that you can't put this regulation in place, that it's illegal. And the court basically says, well, what are you talking about? The Municipal Act does allow townships to impose these kinds of regulations to regulate short-term rental property use. What I find remarkable too, Gavin, is that Airbnb allowed the posting of these units without, a license. And my understanding of some of these platforms is they're supposed to check that they are licensed, and it's, here we have the wild west, which is causing a problem.
Yeah, they all do that. This is the same old thing. A lot of these online apps, like Uber is another one that I've understand. They take the position that all they are is a intermediary between you and a independent contractor on the other end. And similarly with Airbnb, I don't know what obligation they would have in regards to looking at, the properties that are listed on their site, and whether or not there would ever be a claim against them. I suspect it'd be very difficult. The other thing too is that the municipality, you got, Airbnb, I don't know where their servers are, but wherever their servers are, who knows? I mean, Timbuktu, and, the town of Milton would have no ability to regulate Airbnb. They could, it's online. I mean, it's an interesting issue that as we live in a virtual world these days, who governs the internet?
Yeah, well, Gavin, that would be an interesting point for a conflict of laws analysis in terms of if Uber or Airbnb is advertising a property in Milton. They're carrying on business in Milton. So I think an Ontario court would have jurisdiction over that. It's like a internet defamation, right? If I read the defamation in Ontario, the Ontario court would have jurisdiction to deal with that defamatory statement, even if it's on a server in, Dubai or some other part of the world. So, that's an interesting question, and I can tell you from experience that municipal governments are beginning to basically look at Airbnb, and here's again another cost to the taxpayer with respect to properties that are improperly being advertised as short-term rental when they don't have a license, and it causes a problem. Airbnb, I can, like I say, speak from the Hawaii perspective, has actually been liaising with Maui County government to remove properties that are not in a short-term rental zone. Because it does cause a problem. It causes a problem for legitimate short-term rental owners.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole issue is what we see at the moment is really how commerce has evolved so quickly,
Yeah.
and regulation really lags behind it. I mean, in this particular instance, that this situation that's created for the owner of this property. I mean, curiously, the tenant flips the property turns it into a rooming house, gets a whole series of fines and orders that he can't do that. Sues the municipality. In the epilogue of the story, did the landlord ever manage to get rid of this guy, or is he still in the house?
Well, and it's not clear from the decisions whether the tenant has been removed. It almost appears as though, from the comments made by the Ontario Court of Appeal that upheld the lower court decision, saying that the town could enforce its bylaw, seems to suggest that the landlord has other routes that they could take.
Yeah, good luck.
But yeah, exactly right, because they need to go through landlord tenant board to evict a tenant. Because that's
in
a residential.
2029.
Yeah, that's a residential tenancy, and what does the landlord go to court to recoup costs for the unauthorized renovations? Like, who knows what this property looks like now?
Oh, yeah, 100%. And I mean, does anybody think for 1 second that the tenant is just still not going ahead and doing it anyways? I mean, I would suspect that if I went on Airbnb today, I might find that house listed for a short-term rental at a very cheap price if I wanted to sleep in the laundry room down in the basement of this home.
Well, it depends how big the laundry room was. But
I mean, Milton's a lovely little town, but it's not exactly a vacation destination for a lot of people. I mean, these are clearly more than short-term rentals in the usual sense of the word. This is basically a rooming house.
No, for sure. Well, look, Milton's probably like halfway between Toronto and Niagara Falls, so who knows what's being offered there. But I find it remarkable. Here we have this tenant basically making money off of somebody else's property. Like, we don't see in terms of the decision the financial analysis or how much the tenant was making, but I'm pretty sure the tenant was probably making more money than he was paying in rent.
Oh yeah, well that's
the landlord.
100%. It's a pretty bad business model if you're not making more than you're spending, and the leverage here would be I'm paying X dollars in rent and I'm getting Y net afterwards. I mean, the tenant was probably annoyed. He invested all that money in plywood and 2x4s and building these little enclosures. And now his investment was being stopped, and he was going to be out of pocket. I think that, and you add the fines to it, I suppose he had a big problem.
But again, if I'm a landlord, what kind of recourse do I have against the tenant? So in terms of drafting a residential lease, do you now need to put in a clause that the tenant shall not advertise the property for short-term rental or otherwise, and then, if you find out, sue for breach of contract?
Well, you know what's interesting here, I do think from a legal perspective and a larger issue, is the creative argument of the tenant to say that his charter rights have been violated, but on a purely economic basis. And I think that fundamentally, there is no charter protection for economic interest.
That's my understanding from law school, but I haven't taken constitutional law in over 35 years. But I think that's correct. I mean, generally, the charter does not protect an economic interest, just as the charter in Canada does not protect a property right. So, it's like he had no evidence in any event, and the court just basically said, well, there's no evidence, and Section 7, your rights to life, liberty, and security of the person weren't breached, and what equality right was breached? That was Section 15. So the tenant had no evidence. I mean, I think the tenant was basically using the court proceeding as a delay tactic to prevent the enforcement against him and continue to make money while he could.
Sure. I mean, and how long did it take for this proceeding to get through the courts?
Exactly.
6 years, 5 years?
Right, a few years, 2-3 years at least.
Right. And he's a self-represented litigant, right?
I believe so. I think that's
and he
correct.
I'm taking he's never paid any of the costs award. I doubt he's ever paid the fines. And then it raises another issue. I mean, what would be the enforcement procedure? I mean, the fines are they personal or are they against the property owner? I mean, generally speaking, a municipality has the right to levy charges against a property owner. So this landlord, I don't know the answer to this in this particular case, but the recourse is, generally speaking, an order against the property, which would be against title to the property. Now, as a residential tenant, the operator of the rooming house here had no title to any property.
Right.
So the town may have been, in fact, making orders that would ultimately be encumbrances on the title to the landlord, who was the guy getting kind of shafted all the way through the process.
Yeah, and look, I mean, maybe that's why the landlord was the one that brought it forward to kind of cut a deal behind closed doors to make sure that the town didn't enforce against the landlord. Who knows? Or look, I mean, maybe the landlord wants to get rid of the tenant and will convert the house into an Airbnb and make more money out of it. I don't know.
Maybe the landlord was annoyed that the tenant was making all this money and he wanted to, he didn't want to leave the cheese on the table. So that, sure. I mean, it's a lucrative way to operate, residential property. If it's grossing more than you would with a single tenant, that makes commercial sense to me. But obviously, there's a whole whack of other considerations to go into that.
Oh, for sure. Look, my experience with short-term rental, Gavin, is that most people don't make a heck of a lot of money out of it. Yeah, you're absolutely right that basically it covers the costs of your property. May give you a few extra $1,000 in your jeans to spend, but a lot of these things don't make a lot of money. You have to be basically operating, I would say half dozen properties to really make it a legitimate income.
Right, but it does subsidize
but who knows
cost.
what of course, well, it subsidizes the cost for the tenant for sure.
Yeah. So, and I think that, it raises an interesting question from a valuation perspective. If someone did buy a property thinking that they could rent it out and doing that math in their head and paid X amount of dollars for it, and then all of a sudden the rules changed and their ability to earn income off that capital asset was gone, that would effectively devalue the asset, generally speaking. If I could use my truck, for example, if you can use a truck for a business and I can earn money out of it, it's worth more than if truck that I can't use for a business. So, theoretically, any capital asset is worth more if it can earn income, and if it no longer can earn that income, it's going to be worth less. Is that not?
And well, we're seeing
fair?
we're seeing that in Hawaii right now, and unfortunately, I just read a report from a economist that Maui is in a recession, and part of it is this bill to remove rights on short-term rental, and the property values have gone down quite significantly, and it's creating a problem. But anyway, look, Gavin, these are interesting issues, and part of why we dig beneath the law. First of all, no one is above the law, so everyone is beneath it. But it's to talk about these issues and that arise out of these cases, because the courts make a decision, but they have impacts beyond the law, on the black and white letter of the law. And I think it's important, if you're a law student out there, we thank all of our listeners and watchers out there. This is the way you need to think about decisions.
Right, and there's always two sides to every coin, as you know, as a metal detecting aficionado. And there's always two sides to every issue, and always two sides to every policy. Anyways, great discussion, Stephen. Thanks very much. And thank you all again for listening.